So when Edi Rama was elected mayor of Tirana, Albania in the year 2000, things were not looking good. In case it's been a while since your high school geography class, not naming names, just saying, we're all on different journeys here. Albania is just to the north of Greece on the Balkan Peninsula, across the Adriatic Sea from Italy, and surrounded by Montenegro, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. And even if it has been a while since your high school history class, you can probably remember that the 20th century was not really a peaceful time for that region. Albania alone survived occupations by fascist Italy and then Nazi Germany, and then a 40-year communist dictatorship that maintained a stunningly strict policy of isolationism that not only cut it off from its surrounding nations, but that did not even allow for movements of its citizens within their own country. And so, even 10 years after the fall of that government, when Edi Rama took the reins of Tirana, suffering and dysfunction were still omnipresent. The city was overrun with organized crime. The garbage collectors and other civil servants had long ago left their posts because the city's tax revenue was so low they couldn't afford to pay them. So garbage had piled up in the streets. A communist-era aesthetic of concrete buildings and bunkers, most of which had windows barred to keep out the aforementioned crime, gave the city a sad and abandoned look. And because the green spaces in the urban areas hadn't been tended to in decades, people were rarely found outside. And so, somewhat out of desperation, Rama turned to the thing that he knew the best, which was art. Having been a visual artist and a professor of art before his time in politics, he got out the paints, quite literally. He instructed crews to begin painting vibrant, brightly colored designs on the facades of all the buildings in the downtown center of Tirana. And so, somewhat at random, the city that had been gray, concrete, and empty began to fill with color. Now, shortly after that, something kind of strange and unexpected happened. People started coming outside. They wanted to see this new color that had been splashed across the buildings in their city. Before there was any kind of change in number of police on the streets, even though crime had not yet dropped, they started taking the bars off the windows so they could better see the colors that had been put on their city. They stopped littering in the streets, and strangely, they started paying their municipal taxes so the garbage collectors could get rehired and started working again. 5 years later, tax revenue in the city was up by 600%. And the number of new businesses in the city had tripled. Now, of course, the colors weren't the only reform that helped bring Tirana back, but they certainly seemed to be one of the main catalysts for change. Ingrid Fettel-Lee, a professional designer, describes this transformation in her book, Joyful: The Surprising Power of Ordinary Things to Create Extraordinary Happiness. And important for our purposes today, she describes how we tend to think of elements like color and pattern as mostly superfluous, decorative, but not really related to our well-being on any deep level. Yet she uses the example of Tirana, as well as many others, to show that our outlook, as shaped by our exterior environment, really does have a lot to do with our interior sense of well-being. And I found that really interesting, and I found myself wanting to make a connection this morning between that concept and the idea of joy as an act of resilience. Because I think sometimes we tend to think of joy as being sort of superfluous, something that's like nice to have, but not essential. Psychologists will tell us that habits of joy are often the first things to go from our daily routine when we're in times of crisis or stress. likely because they feel too trivial in the face of more pressing concerns. Some of us are habituated to leave joy aside when we're working, right? Pushing through our tasks and leaving happier pursuits until they're completed. And sometimes some of us feel guilty feeling joyful when others around us are struggling. I think these are all reasonable responses to challenging circumstances. But more and more, I've also been thinking about how joy may actually be a critical spiritual discipline, an essential habit of resilience, something to practice especially in difficult times, because it is something that we need to keep up in our lives if we are to truly survive and thrive. Now, I think this has something to do with joy being something that connects us to our humanity, right? To our human dignity, reminding us that we are worthy of delight. And I also think that in connecting us to our createdness, joy connects us to the one who created us, right? The one who longs for and strives for our wholeness, the one known by many of us as God, but by others as another name. You know, it's interesting, once you start to look for this idea about joy being a holy habit, you really do start to see it everywhere. The Apostle Paul, for instance, is talking about joy all the time. Have you ever noticed that? Every 2 verses, it seems like he's like saying rejoice, okay? On the road, in the prison cell, in the church, in the home, rejoice, 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 rejoice. Rejoice always, rejoice in prayer, rejoice in yourself no matter what. And Paul was a kind of a strange guy. I'm willing to say that. But I don't think that his proclamation about joy is some sort of escapist denial. This is coming from a guy who found himself in prison fairly often and running from murderous crowds kind of on the regular. I think his exhortation to joy must be more a matter of spiritual guidance for an emerging faith, right? Take time to practice joy. Now, it's interesting. In this instruction, Paul reflects many of the Psalms from the Hebrew Bible, which ostensibly he knew well. Even the Psalms in our scripture that are reflective of a deep lament often resolve on a note of joy. I don't know if you've noticed that. Psalm 13 starts with, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" But it ends with, "My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." Psalm 71 begs God, "Rescue me, O God, out of the hand of the wicked, out of the grasp of the wrongdoer and ruthless man." But it ends with, "My lips shout for joy when I sing praises to you." And then there's Psalm 126, which we heard today, which offers this beautiful, visceral word about joy, one which connects it to memory and to hope. When God restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. You feel that uplift as you hear those words? It continues again in a refrain about the future. Restore our fortunes again, O Lord. I love how this blossoming poem finds the thread in holy joy that connects our delight in this moment with gratitude for the past and hopeful anticipation of the future. And I think that is indeed a holy practice, to connect our habits of joy in the present moment to the eternal presence and activity of God. Maybe that's one other thing we can say, that joy lifts us above this moment, giving us perspective to see that we are part of a larger story, God's story, which is ultimately a story about mercy and blessing, a story about deliverance and freedom. And moments of joy, I think, help us to claim that truth as our truth. Help us to pledge allegiance to that story as our story, rather than whatever story about death and dishonesty is currently active in our midst. Actually, maybe in that way we could also say our habits of joy are habits of embodying trust in God, knowing that this moment's difficulties are not evidence of God's absence, but that maybe they are glimpses of the abundant life that we trust will come because of our faith in God's redemption. Now, 20th century German theologian Karl Barth, who was an essential voice in warning the Church of Germany against capitulating to Nazism, he talked quite a bit about joy, which is sort of surprising because he has a reputation as being kind of a dour figure, Karl Barth. But he wrote a lot about joy. And he described it as a defiant nevertheless. I love that. Joy is a defiant nevertheless, indicating that it points us toward an all-powerful God, even in times when we feel particularly powerless. So that's Karl Barth. But then there's Jesus, right? I mean, he seems to have been mostly a pretty serious fellow, but he certainly knew his way around a party. That's something we hear in the Gospels. He was known, as maybe you can remember, for turning water into wine, for dining with the most raucous dinner guests. He was regularly accused by his opponents of eating and drinking too much. And he's known for telling his disciples, just a few chapters after the one we read this morning, that he had done it all, that he had been born and lived and worked and taught, and that he would die so that what? So that their joy would be complete. I mean, even in the scene with Mary that we heard, I was thinking about this. Is there any joy to be found here? It tends to be framed as a really melancholy, mournful story. It's actually not a story the church is great at talking about because it's also a very sensual story, right? So they're at this dinner. Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead. They're at his house. And now the authorities are after them both. And Jesus is pretty confident that he's going toward his death, that it's just a matter of time. And here comes Mary with this expensive jar of nard to anoint him, essentially, for his burial. It's a very heavy story. But of course, then there's Judas like mansplaining the business side of the whole thing, which you just can't get enough of that, right? So they're all there. And I'm thinking about this scene, and I was wondering if it isn't possible to think about this scene as having a quality of the defiant nevertheless. I wonder if it's possible to think about it like, I don't know, you get some tough news one day and you decide to bust out that good bottle of champagne you've been keeping in your basement forever, right? Because you know that time is not guaranteed. Maybe it's like using your best china on a Tuesday evening for dinner because why not, right? Jesus knows he's going to die. And Mary says, you know, I've been keeping this jar of perfume for I don't know what. Why don't we just use it? Why don't we make this a pleasurable, memorable day? Heck, I'll even soak up some of the extra with my hair. So that when I go forward from here, I too will smell it and feel joy. And I will remember when I sat at the table with my living brother who once was dead. And I will anticipate how I'll sit at that same table again with my living Lord. What a joy. Can you see that? Can you feel that with Mary? And more importantly, can you sense opportunities in your own life to do something similar? I'm not talking about taking off on some hedonistic path that ignores the realities that are all around us. But there are fear and anger and loneliness aplenty out there right now. Certainly we can also add some joy. Talking about simple things. When you see something beautiful out there, stopping for an extra few moments to look at it. When you find yourself laughing, just staying in that spirit for just a few moments. Here's a hard one for me. When someone tries to bless you, say, yes, thank you, instead of, no, I couldn't possibly. When you have the chance to bless someone else, do it without a thought. When you have the chance to fill this world with color or poetry or flowers or laughter or service, do it, knowing that it is your holy duty and your Christian joy, your act of resilience and an act of resistance. Offer these thoughts and those invitations in the name of the God who takes joy in us, who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.